Welcome to Windsor Castle Park. This is the original home of the Arthur Smith family. Arthur Smith I arrived in Virginia in 1622 and resided in Kecoughtan, what is now Hampton, until 1637, when he received a patent for about 1,400 acres on this side of the James River. He received this patent for bringing over 29 new colonists to the early Virginia colony. The original house would have a very steep roof as well as a chimney on either side. Some of the archaeological excavations that have gone on, we found evidence of the 17th century residence. We have a spoon handle that is from a spoon around the 1630s. Now, Arthur Smith IV married and moved to Bacon's Castle in Surrey County, and his nephew, Thomas Smith, lived here in the house. He left it to his son, Arthur Smith V, who eventually sold it to the Jordan family in 1838. When that family moved in, they added on to the house. Mr. Jordan had married Anne Marshall Boykin, and they had 19 to 23 children, depending on which sources you see. Archaeologists find now in the area a lot of window glass when they were doing some renovations here, as well as some other things. Underneath where the addition would be, we find a set of stirrups, as well as pottery pieces. A lot of different pottery that was probably thrown away when the Jordans moved in that belonged to the Smith family. The Windsor Castle house in the 17th and 18th century would have had a typical kitchen garden. In the 20th century, the Betts family had their kitchen garden right here, and most likely this is where the kitchen garden would have been in the earlier time periods. In the kitchen garden also would have been some unique tools like a bell jar. This is a piece of a bell jar from the 18th century. A bell jar was a jar that they would place over plants to prevent plants like artichokes from freezing in the early part of the spring. Next to me would be something that was used in the 19th and 20th century. This is referred to as a hog pot. This gigantic pot and kettle would have been filled with water with a fire built under it. And it was used to scald hogs to be able to remove the hair, and then to cook down lard and other hog-related products with that. It is so huge that it's been sitting here for probably over 100 years, and no reference to move it anytime soon. When the English arrived here in 1607, they discovered that pigs were the perfect colonist for eastern Virginia. Pigs traveled well on ships. They eat about anything. They're omnivores, and they can take care of themselves. So they will allow pigs to roam in islands like Hog Island in Surrey County. They could reproduce quickly, they found their own food, and they grew tusk. So pigs became a main part of the diet of early colonists here in Virginia. We find documentation of them selling lard and hams to England and exporting those as early as the 1680s and beyond. Now, the pigs that came with the English were traditional English breed, Berkshire. And when the colonists were here, they salted hams, but they noticed that the Native Americans also smoked their meat. They would put the meat in the top of their houses, or they would put it over a fire, and they would smoke the meat to preserve it. So the English combined salting hams as well as smoking them to create what we know as Smithfield ham today. They built smokehouses such as this one to smoke their product. This smokehouse is very large on the Windsor Castle property. There's one theory that maybe 200 plus hams could be hung in this smokehouse at one time. That's about 100 hogs. The hams would sit up in the smokehouse through the spring and into the summer. And as the summer wore on, the heat would cause the fat to drip. And you'll notice as you're looking up, the very bottom rungs have a lot of fat on them where it had dripped down. The workers would climb up into the rafters, starting hanging the hams at the very top and working their way down. They also would hang bacon and other shoulders as well. The lard would be rendered down in the large hog pot we just saw, and from there it could be exported. Now we know in 1740s, Mallory Todd here in Smithfield was exporting hams to the Caribbean, and hams became a major export as well as lard and bacon. One of the things found in archaeological excavations is a hog tusk. Domestic hogs don't have tusks, but they're allowed to run wild in the woods and feed for themselves. They find their own, they grow tusks to protect themselves. Doesn't look like much, but in the mouth of a pig that's pretty angry at you would be quite dangerous. The Arthur Smith family would have had a smokehouse like this one. This one was built in the probably early part of the 1800s. The Smith family would have had hogs and would have been able to export hams and lard from their wharf right down the hill here. Windsor Castle Farm was an active farm all the way up into the modern era. The first part of this building, which is in the center, would be an 18th century, 1700s barn. You can see the original piers here, and we have the original wood inside. On the sides, they were added probably in the 1840s or a little bit later, creating a barn that could hold corn. It could hold lots of other products grown on the farm, peas. We know they were growing soybeans and black-eyed peas for feeding their pigs. So the barn itself has been standing since the 18th century. Very important part of the farm. You'll notice there were a lot of barns in this area, and they're very close to the household, so you can have easy access. The kitchen was built around the same time as the house, around 1725 to 1740. The kitchen has two rooms on the first floor. One is the actual kitchen. The second, this room would be where the washroom was, or the still room is what they called it. The stairs go upstairs to two rooms upstairs that would have been where the servants or slaves would have been housed. We have done some excavations. There's been pottery found, as well as a rib bone for a cow. Beef was an important part of the diet because it was such a large animal. The kitchen was the center part of the community. Children would be playing in the area, and one of the things they found underneath the steps was a clay marble. Now, this marble is a typical marble from the early 18th century all the way up into the 1900s. But you see children actively living in this area, and find evidence of not only bones and pottery, but playthings as well. The kitchen was the heavily used building. It also has a root cellar in it, and a root cellar is important because of the kitchen garden next door. They would store root vegetables for the winter. We know a little bit about what was in the kitchen from Arthur Smith, the Force inventory of his house. We know there were 3 kitchen tables. We also know there were 35 candle molds in the kitchen. They also had chocolate pots, coffee pots. In the inventory was also sugar, hams, and a number of other kitchen items. Quite a bit, showing that the kitchen produced a lot of food for the residents as well as visitors to the house. In 1884, Jeremiah Johnson bought the house and the farm. The house itself he remodeled. The outbuildings in the area were somewhat remodeled, but Jeremiah Johnson did not want to do too much farming, so he actually rented the farm out. And in 1916, he had a lease for the farm, and the farm manager would actually use this building as his office. This building is very unique as it's been restored. Much of the building dates back to the late 1700s. We don't know if this was a storage building, a building used by someone managing the slaves here on the farm, or just as an office space outside of the house. The unique architecture goes all the way up to the modern era, where the chimney had been updated to have a hole here for a stove. The 20th century barns here at Windsor Castle Park, the first barns were peanut barns. The Johnsons and before them the Jordans would grow peanuts. They also would have mules to pull the plow and to work on the farm. So this little small barn here is what was referred to as a mule barn. Mules weren't very tall. They're pretty easy to maintain. It's got a great little hopper here that you could put his food in. So the barns were a very important part of the farm. Behind the mule barn would be also a corn crib. A corn crib, again, a valuable part of the farm for feed for the animals. When Arthur Smith first passed away, his will stated that he wanted to be buried next to his loving wife. We don't quite know where that initial grave is on the property, but we do know this area was a cemetery. The cemetery has 2 graves in it currently, one dating to 1870 and one dating to 1921. This area was kind of marked out of the fields. It has trees growing in it. So in 2018, some ground penetrating radar was used and found what could be possibility of more burial sites in this area. The tradition in early Virginia was to be buried on your plantation or your homestead, and so we imagine this is probably the Smith family burial ground. In 1884, when the Johnson family purchased the house, the Johnson and Betts added all the plumbing to the house, they added the electricity to the house, they put in a septic system, and they had to dig a brand new well. The Betts family also did a lot of the landscaping. Charles Betts had a paperweight that was on his desk, and in the paperweight is a photograph of the house. And you can see this magnolia tree I'm standing under is a very, very small sapling at the time. The Betts family finally sold the house to the McMurrins, and then the house came to the town of Smithfield in 2008. The town of Smithfield has been working on renovating the house, updating the house for events, and during some of the renovations, some interesting things have been found. And taking the paint off the front door of the house, we found some interesting etchings done by a child, most likely, of a ship, and some lovely ladies. And we were assuming that somebody had just received a new pocket knife and decided to practice with it. So we found some interesting things telling the story about the Windsor Castle house. The important thing about the Windsor Castle farm and house is it's been in existence since 1634. This has always been a home, a working farm for a number of families throughout history, and it continues to be a working farm and a popular spot here in Smithfield to visit, to walk the trails. So join the town of Smithfield and come by and see the Windsor Castle Park and enjoy your visit in view of Cypress Creek.